Thanks very much for inviting me. You've probably heard stories like this before. This is one of these things that goes round and round and round. Are antidepressants actually good for us or bad for us? Do they cause suicide or help prevent suicide? And I'm just going to push the train a little bit further again to look at what people are currently saying, and even what people say other people doubt. And I think you have to realise the context of this. It's a very important context. For one thing, around about 10% of New Zealanders are taking antidepressants, which is a pretty frightening statistic in some ways, so it really does matter. And secondly, there's a whole lot of commercial and other influences within all these studies, and you just have to keep in mind dogmatic doubt is my view. You have to be sceptical of everything I say as well. I'd like to say I don't get any sponsorship from drug companies, I don't accept their travel, I don't do anything with them anymore. They don't invite me actually after my talks. So, what's happened? Well, this all began, you probably know this, but I'll just go through it very briefly. In 1990, and this is when SSRIs began their rise. Well, fluoxetine actually, sort of the Prozac nation, if you remember. There were books about everything was about Prozac, everything was about antidepressants. There was a paper came out which said that in some people there was an emergence of intense suicidal preoccupation during fluoxetine treatment. And this came out and people got concerned, of course, because this drug was being increasingly prescribed. And so an FDA expert panel got together. I'm not quite sure what they looked at, but they basically said there was no clear evidence of increased risk. So everyone sort of relaxed for a while, and you'll see this is the story. We all relax, and then we all get excited again. So 1991, things were quite calm. There were still reports coming in of antidepressants, particularly SSRIs, causing strange behaviours. And two behaviours. One was suicidal behaviour, but there were also some people were getting legal defences based on aggressive acts where they had assaulted other people, claiming that antidepressants had caused them to do this. And then in 2000, there was a large meta-analysis was done, and basically things seemed to sort of, according to meta-analysis, goods, not only were symptoms were reduced, but suicide risk was also reduced in patients treated with placebo and antidepressant trials or treated with drugs. So again, it all looked a bit better. Then there was another study came out, and this is what keeps happening. Academics need to make a living, they need to get papers out, and one of the easiest ways to get papers out is to do meta-analysis, and the easiest way is to do meta-analysis about suicide studies, as we'll see. They just keep coming out again and again, antidepressants. And this was another one that said suicide risk in placebo-controlled trials, risk equivalent, okay? So there is a risk when you are depressed, but it's not any different placebo or not. Then in 2004, there was another analysis done, a reanalysis of the reanalysis, if you like. And this resulted in quite a change. The FDA suddenly said all manufacturers who'd sponsored antidepressants trials in children and adolescents had to give their trials to the FDA so they could search for suicidality, because the theme that was emerging was if there was a problem, it looked like it was particularly in adolescents and children. Now, one of the real interesting things about this is they discovered a whole lot of trials which were never published. So there were quite a few trials in adolescent children on drugs like venlafaxine and paroxetine, which showed the antidepressant was ineffective, and so rather than publishing that, the drug company had quietly forgotten the data. And so when this data was added to the data on fluoxetine, where there is one study just that shows it might be effective in children and adolescents, we ended up with this a relative risk of suicidal behaviour of about double. So the chances of getting suicidal ideation, and this is not the same as suicide, I have to say. This is thinking about or suicidal ideation or suicidal behaviours increased. That led to the famous boxed warning on antidepressant labelling. This never came to New Zealand, but in the United States, it's still there now. There's a black box warning on all antidepressants stating there's a risk in children and adolescents. Now, in 2009, there were still academics requiring some sort of career, so someone did another meta-analysis. And this was called the definitive meta-analysis, and I could probably, in fact, 3 years ago I could stop my talk here, and it really made sense, and I felt quite confident. Unfortunately, there's been more meta-analysis since this definitive meta-analysis, as you'll see. But what happened was they did this very large study looking at the risk of suicidality in clinical trials of antidepressants in adults, which included adolescents, analysis of all the data from the FDA, all the new data and all the new studies. It was published in the British Medical Journal. And you can see how many trials go on. This gives you an idea of the market for antidepressants. There were 372 double-blind, randomised, placebo-controlled trials with 99,000 participants. And then, interestingly, quite a lot of the indications were not for depression. So antidepressants were used for major depression in less than half the time. And these studies They were used for other depressions, whatever they are, other psychiatric disorders, particularly anxiety disorders, and also non-psychiatric disorders. So antidepressants have been used in tic disorders. They've been used, actually, there were several trials to try and lose weight. So antidepressants, you give them to everyone just in case. You never know. Gives you a new measure, gives you a new way of selling your antidepressant. And the outcome measures were this. So this was finally going to be it. And what they found was, one thing was that suicidal behaviour and ideation was rare in the non-psychiatric populations who got into these trials, but as we'll discuss, it's actually quite rare in the psychiatric populations who get into this trial, because you're not allowed to get into the trial if you've got suicidal ideation, which does create a problem. And what they showed was the overall risk was slightly lower, although it's not significant, in those who got antidepressants, but there was a real difference. And this seemed to be, this may, well, I had hoped would explain all these contradictory findings. and what they showed was, essentially, if you were less than 25, then there was a difference. That essentially your behaviour and ideation was increased from drug compared to placebo. If you were 25 to 64, it seemed to make no difference. And if you were over 65, it seemed to be beneficial. It actually reduced your risk of suicidal ideation or behaviour. And so they did this very nice continuous variable odds ratio, as you can see, and they showed that it declined year by year. So the younger you were, the more likely it was that suicidal ideation that antidepressants would cause some increase in your suicidal ideation. And the older you got, the less likely it was, and the less problems there were. So this to me seemed like, well, that finally explains things. If this was 2009, I could stop now and go away and say, be really cautious when you use antidepressants in adolescents or adults under 24. Now, this hasn't been, unfortunately, the thing. The problem is that this data is very limited, and one of the big problems is, how do you measure the effect of antidepressants on suicidal ideation or behaviour when most trials exclude people with suicidal ideation or behaviour because half of them are getting placebo? So certainly anyone of moderate to high risk was excluded, and sometimes all patients with suicidal ideation. There's only one thing suicidal ideation can do if you've got none, and that's it can go up. It can't go down. You don't get minus suicidal ideation. And they also exclude patients with alcohol and drug disorders. And again, any clinicians here will know that this is a really common comorbidity in depressed patients and probably affects the outcome. They also exclude anyone with borderline personality disorder, which again seems to be a bit rough if you're trying to look at suicidal ideation or behaviours, and any personality disorders were usually excluded. So you basically had this whole problem of any patients with even low to moderate risk to be excluded. And the other problem was observations were very short term. So it said, well, over 6 to 10 weeks this might happen, but in the long run, does it actually matter? And that's, of course, what counts. Depression tends to be a chronic, recurring, relapsing disorder for at least half the people who suffer from it. So even if in the short term you could say, well, maybe there's a bit of increase, does it help in the long term? So people tried other studies. And one was case control studies, and this they looked at patients who were actually like the patients we see, not patients who come into drug trials. So these were patients who were hospitalised or patients who were being treated in general clinics. And you couldn't do a placebo-controlled trial, so they did a case control studies. And basically they showed in one study there was no association between suicidal behaviour and hospitalised patients, except in those aged 6 to 18. So again, there's this vague signal, is something going on with young people and adolescents. Another study showed no difference between tricyclics, because some people thought this is a specific effect of serotonin reuptake inhibitors. It's not a general antidepressant effect. And again, the study showed none, but again, there was a trend of increasing risk in those 18 and younger. And there was one other study that showed if there is a rise, it's in the first month of SSRI treatment. So there were some sort of clinical ideas coming through. You're starting to think, well, this starts to make sense, be cautious in younger people, monitor more closely, usually emerges in the first few months. Now, we did a study looking at a non-selected population who were randomised to fluoxetine or nortriptyline. And you can probably see in a non-selected population, if you just take outpatients, these were outpatients, they weren't even inpatients, and we asked very carefully about suicide, and in our sample, which wasn't very abnormal, nearly a quarter had made a suicide attempt in the 6 months prior to coming into the study, which is a heck of a lot when you think about it, and you can see it was actually quite rare for these patients not to be thinking of suicide at some point. Only 20% said they had no thoughts of suicide at all in the 6 months before coming into the study. What you'll also see is that most of these patients would have been excluded from a drug company study, so they would never have got in. You certainly, if you had moderate or regular or previous suicide attempts in the 6 months, you wouldn't have gotten the study. So you would have been highly abnormal. But the advantage of having a sample where lots of people have suicidal ideation, you can actually see, well, what does medication do to suicidal ideation? And you can see what it does. This uses a measure called the MADRS. I won't go into it, but it's basically a very simple question about how suicidal people are. And what happened in our study anyway, when they began, you can see nearly half of them had some thoughts of suicide. This dropped very dramatically. Interestingly, it dropped actually before their mood got a lot better. Most people's mood took 6 weeks to get better, but by 3 weeks, their MADRS score had dropped dramatically, and it stayed low for the next 6 months. In fact, we've just looked at the 5-year data. It stays low for the next 5 years. Now, I've got no idea why. A lot of these patients came off their medication. We think it's actually being in a trial makes you get less suicidal. We don't know why. Except these patients actually said it was a very different experience for them than it usually is in a psychiatric hospital, in the sense that we wanted to follow them up because we wanted to know what happened to them. And of course, because we wanted to do that, they got regular contact with us, and they thought, and they were right, we did care about them, but we also wanted to know their data. So they had this different relationship with us, because they said if they went to a sector base and they didn't turn up, everyone went, oh, thank goodness for that, and had an hour off, whereas we went and chased them and said, what's happened to you? So I don't know whether it's a drug effect, but in our study at least, you can see that actually there was a reduction in suicidal ideation. Also, but there was some sort of interesting idea. So in the next 6 months, 20 people attempted suicide and 1 completed suicide. And that was the only person in the whole study for the next 5 years. And that person actually didn't enter the study. They came in, had an assessment, and left. That person had no suicidal ideation and had never had a previous attempt. So they would have been in the low-risk group, and yet they were the one that ended up committing suicide, which gives you some idea of how hard it is to work out who's actually going to do it. We did have... So there was a number of people, about 20 of 91 patients, who had no score at the beginning, but at some point they got a bit of suicidal ideation. But we had a far bigger group who were suicidal or had suicidal thoughts and did not have any significant suicidal thoughts throughout the study. And we looked for age effects and we found none. But our study's pretty small, and there was only about a quarter of them were aged 18 to 24, and we had no adolescents, so it really isn't a good study to do that. But it does show that, well, I'm not sure if there's a drug effect, but certainly in a clinical population like we had, we didn't find an increase. We did in a few people, as you can see, but not overall. Overall, people seem to benefit. There's also been a long-term study looking at just an observational study. They had 757 patients, and what they basically showed was antidepressant therapy was more likely when your symptoms were worse. Well, that's pretty logical. But the risk of suicide or suicide attempts reduced by 20% among those taking antidepressants. So they claimed, and this was a naturalistic study, that there seemed to be a reduction. However, people weren't randomly put on antidepressants, so you can't be sure. And here was another study again. This was quite an interesting study because what they showed, they looked at outpatients and they were randomized to psychotherapy or SSRIs. And what they discovered, quite surprisingly, was that in fact SSRIs were associated with a lower risk of emerging suicidal ideation than having psychotherapy. So that was a very difficult thing to explain if there's direct drug effect, but it's not as easy as that. So it all started we started thinking, oh, it's all looking pretty good actually. Medications might be all right if you look at real clinical populations. There's also been population studies, and these are more interesting in some ways because they don't just look at suicidal ideation or suicidal behaviours, they can actually look at suicide because they have the numbers. So there's an enormous study just came out this year, about 2 months ago, which had 29 European countries, which has 514 million people, and they looked at the interaction between antidepressant use and suicide, and this is not suicidal, this is suicide over 2 time periods, 1980 to 1994, and 1995 to 2009. Now the first thing, which is quite extraordinary really, the use of antidepressants increased on average by nearly 20% per year. If this keeps going, we're all going to be on antidepressants in about 20 years' time. And I'll talk a little about what that might mean. However, the standard death rate for suicide decreased at about 0.81% per year, so there was a corresponding reduction. So they concluded there was a strong inverse relationship between these trends. Okay? Whether they're causal or not is completely unknown, but there certainly wasn't evidence that there was an increase associated. So again, seemed reassuring. Then came another meta-analysis. We've nearly finished the meta-analysis. And this is a journal, Statistical Methods in Medical Research. If you ever have insomnia, get this journal, honestly. It is brilliant. It's written by statisticians for statisticians, which is, I don't know, I've never been to a statisticians conference, but I've begun to imagine what it would be like. But anyway, they actually looked at efficacy and suicidal risk for antidepressants and pediatrics. So they looked at the group that we were still a bit worried about. People were saying, because most of these adult studies weren't looking at children and adolescents, they were looking at adults, most of the epidemiology studies and the clinical studies. And so basically what they showed was that obviously specific problems, there are real problems with any sort of meta-analysis because the outcome is rare. Suicide, although it's actually quite a common cause of death, is actually a relatively rare event compared to suicidal ideation or suicidal behaviours. And what they found is that antidepressants have statistically significant effects in terms of efficacy, but pretty moderate, frankly. So antidepressants work, but not that well in general. So an effect size of 0.32, you wouldn't jump up and down about for certain. But also they found antidepressants do have a trend to increase suicidal ideation or behaviour. And you just have to trust these statistics. I've got no idea if they're right in the way they did it, but this was the most complex and apparently carefully done statistical model ever done on all this data. And so they showed the absolute risk, which I guess is what we need to talk about, is an increase of 9 per 1,000 patients will experience suicidal behaviour or ideation. So they're saying there is actually a very modest effect in adolescence, which is worth remembering, and there is a real, albeit very modest, increase in suicidal ideation and behaviours. So again, I started to relax. I thought this could be my message. Then came another reanalysis of the randomised placebo control. These are mainly American universities where clearly they don't have enough original data, so they completely do. So this was another one where they studied all the suicide items and events in 9,000 patients in all sponsor-controlled, which is interesting, and then we'll come back to that, RCTs of fluoxetine and venlafaxine. And what they showed was that suicidal thoughts and behaviours decreased over time for adult and elderly patients for drugs versus placebo, and no difference found in youth. So finally, this came out late last year, and you could think, well, finally we know. Okay, so they've done yet another meta-analysis. This isn't as big as the other meta-analysis, but in case you were feeling comfortable, this was immediately challenged again. So there were letters written from this guy called Spielman and Bernie Carroll, both from the United States, who pointed out quite correctly that the youth fluoxetine data was from a trial of patients who didn't actually have depression, who had ADHD, and all those patients were also taking another drug called, as you can see. The youth data and this is even more concerning, I didn't know about this, I got rung up when someone told me this had happened. The youth data on venlafaxine was left out. So they said, well, I've done all the venlafaxine trials, I'll accept the trial on youth. And it wasn't clear why. And this reported that 11 of the 182 patients receiving venlafaxine experienced a suicide-related event, compared with 1 of 179 receiving placebo. Now, this wasn't suicidal ideation, and they made that point. They said, if you look at suicidal events, that's actually a bit different from ideation. The ideation was similar, but actual events strongly suggested that you were more likely if you're an adolescent on venlafaxine. And the measures, as I said, using ratings are not suicide events. Again, even in the treatment, the TAD study, which is one of the only studies that have shown antidepressants work in adolescents, and only fluoxetine, they didn't look at the attempts, and this letter claimed, and I've looked it up and tried to find out, that 17 of the 18 attempts in that trial occurred in those taking fluoxetine, but those ratings were never published. So you really begin to worry again. So again, I have this general sense of unease. So we then had someone trying to summarise this, but it wasn't another meta-analysis. I've got no more meta-analysis, they're finished. So what this sort of seemed to say, so this was an editorial done just earlier this year, and they said the antidepressants do not appear to be associated with an overall increase in suicide in the population and may even be associated with a fall. However, in young people, there is a persistent trend for antidepressants to be associated with an increase in suicidal behaviour. And that's really, I guess, the message that comes through, right through. There's always this worrying, niggly trend that in young people, antidepressants are associated with it. Antidepressants are probably less effective in young people as well, so the risk-benefit ratio is clearly worse than in adults and in the elderly. And that's probably, if there is a well, I'll go, that's probably the major take-home message, that you, in adolescence, you need to be more cautious. Now, one reason, Gamey says, is that young people might be misdiagnosed bipolar depression. He claims that one of the reasons this might happen is you give a young person an antidepressant, and what it does is it sets up this mixed affective state where they actually get these mixture of manic and affective and depressed symptoms, and in that state people are more vulnerable to suicidal behaviours and acts. So maybe it's a misdiagnosis rather than simply being an age-related thing. However, having said that, antidepressants clearly don't work as well in adolescence, and really the only evidence base is for fluoxetine. So, I'll just check something. Really, is it futile? Am I just, you've heard this whole story. Is it futile to try and answer these questions that are beyond the reach of available methods or data sets? We really don't have the data set. What we really need is for 1 million people to be randomised to an antidepressant or not and see what happens to them. That would be a really interesting experiment. And we would see, would they get better? Would they get worse? Would they get more suicidal? We've almost done the thing. We've got 10%, but we need 50%, and it has to be random, and we're not doing that at the moment. Can these studies cited justify questioning or affirming the black box warning, or are they simply too flawed to do so? And I think probably at the moment you have to say they are. So where do we really go? So what do we know? Well, first of all, we know the concept of depression since DSM-3 has widened to include all kinds of depressive symptoms, and major depression implies depression as a homogeneous entity. And I think this is wrong. I think we've gone too far. I think we've gone far too mild, and there are far too many people taking antidepressants. But I don't actually have any really good evidence for that. That's just my gut feeling, if you like. Antidepressant prescribing is increasing. Well, that's obviously true in New Zealand and everywhere else. And as I said, if it continues to increase, it will get sort of farcical. We will have 20-30% of the population taking antidepressants. It seems to be flattening off, but you'd hope so once 1 in 10 people. I mean, we know there are going to be a considerable number of people in this room who are taking antidepressants. Now, meta-analysis of treatment suggests overall antidepressants are not actually that great. Okay, so there's one meta-analysis you might remember, another meta-analysis, not about suicide, but about antidepressants, which said they don't work at all, in fact. They don't have a clinical effect, but this is by Kirsch, but they lied a bit because if you looked at the severe end, they did have a significant effect. And it's therefore, I think it's reasonable to say antidepressants are more effective in moderate to severe acute depressive episodes. That seems to be where they work. Antidepressants, and I won't go into this, are probably less effective than previously believed in major depression, especially in the long term, and they're possibly ineffective completely and may even be harmful in bipolar depression. So we really do have to be, I think, a lot more circumspect about how we start. I mean, my practice has changed from putting fewer people on antidepressants but tending to keep them on longer. I can go into this, but there are other reasons for that. But I think there are real concerns that we're treating sadness as though it's an illness, we're putting everyone on antidepressants, and in some groups that may be causing a problem. So, I think it's reasonable to say the risk-benefit ratio in antidepressants in adults and the elderly who suffer from moderate to severe depression, and I'm talking about people who are psychotic, people who've got melancholic features, which I won't go into, but where they're sort of vegetative, where they're slowed up, where they have sleep, where they're not eating, and probably chronic depression, so that's depression that's gone on for more than a couple of years, justifies their use and also seems to be associated with a reduction in suicidality. However, the risk-benefit ratio of antidepressants in children and adolescents who suffer from mild or moderate depression does not seem to justify their use and may be associated with an increase in suicidality. Now, it's easy for me to say that because I don't treat children and adolescents, but the real problem is we have no trials at all. We have trials in adults with mild depression where it would appear the risk-benefit ratio is not worth it. I mean, essentially, there's very little difference, but you probably aren't increasing their suicidal ideation. The real problem we have no trials about severely depressed children and adolescents and what we should do with them, because they are different from the people in the studies are relatively mild, they don't have comorbidities, they don't have the things clinicians see, And we really are in a sticky place, to be blunt, where we've got these people who may or may not benefit from antidepressants. We know in the mild end they don't. We possibly are going to increase their suicide risk, and we possibly aren't going to give them any benefit while we do that. So that's the group we have to be more cautious, and that's the group where we really do need some sort of trial to see, does it work in these more complex, difficult, and severely depressed adolescents. Thanks very much.